Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for what should be quite an interesting webinar. I would just quickly like to introduce Donald MacKay, from the CEO at XA Global Trade Advisors, and Dr. Daan Steenkamp from Codera Analytics. Just before we get started, there might be media in the webinar, so if you don't want anything to pop up anywhere, please just keep that in mind. And also, if you could if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A section and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much. Donald?
Thank you, Nadia. My name is Donald MacKay. As Nadia said, CEO of XA Global Trade Advisors. We do pretty much what it says on the label. We advise companies on global trade issues. Joining me today is Daan, the CEO of Codera Analytics, which is an economics and finance analytics business, suppliers of superb economic and financial data. And so let's perhaps start with, why on earth would we have taken on such a study? This is at the heart of neither of our businesses. But we thought this was important because there's been so much heat and anger and screaming in the media and so little actual data presented, that we thought to have this conversation in a way that's truly useful, it would make sense to get down to what the data itself actually says. Now, this study is very limited. We did this in quite a short amount of time. So this is certainly not meant to be the pervasive answer to all things related to BEE, but we hope it can be used to make a positive contribution to the conversation. Daan and I both, to be very clear, believe transformation is absolutely essential for South Africa to have a thriving economy. The point of this study is not to get into a debate on whether or not there should be transformation. We take that as a given. We take as a given that the wrongs of the past have got to be addressed. The question we have is, does BEE get us there? In other words, if we continue down this road, do we get to a transformed and healthy and thriving economy? And so to start this off, I'm going to show you perhaps the piece of data that most stunned me when we did the work, which is this over here. So the JSE has an empowerment section, which is a very small group of shares which are listed there, which can only be owned by Black people. So the trade in those shares is limited. There are very special rules on how those trades need to occur. And this creates a very interesting natural experiment, which is that if you own one of these shares, are you better off owning in our case, we're going to deal with the Sasol version of that share. Are you better off owning the BEE share, or are you better off owning the Sasol share? And it's not only Sasol who did this. MTN had their version. Their particular program came to an end at the start of this year. Vodacom have their program, and so on. Now, that 57% you are seeing over there, that is the size of the discount currently between owning a normal Sasol share and owning a JSE empowerment version of that Sasol share. So let's have a look at what happened here. If we go back to May 2016, when the Sol BE1 share was listed, it listed at a 23% discount. That discount has subsequently widened over a decade to 57%. What is it about these shares? Are there any differences in the economic benefits you get as a shareholder, etc.? And the answer there is a resounding no. So it doesn't matter which of these shares you own, you're entitled to the same dividends, etc. There is nothing else. However, if you're a Black shareholder of the Sasol share versus a white shareholder, or just a person holding the share, whatever their race, but not holding the restricted share, you would be substantially better off. And so the question is, why do we have this? And a part of the reason that you have such a program is because that BEE certificate has real value to the company. So this is not about the black shareholders that hold onto those shares. Rather, it is about ensuring that that BEE rating can never change and consequently restricting the economic benefits that would flow to those black shareholders. That lack of liquidity is what creates the problem. I'm going to hand over to Daan at this point, who's going to talk through the survey that we did, how it worked, and what the outcomes were. But bear this in mind because we're going to revisit it again at the end.
Great. Thanks, Donald. So as Donald said, we ran a survey, and the reason we ran a survey is because unfortunately there's very little of the data that's collected around BEE compliance. Very little of that is actually in the public domain. So it means that researchers and the market are not in a position to actually assess the impacts of these regulations. So we really wanted to get as many survey responses as possible. And so we sent the survey out to many different groups, businesses across different industries, including many firms that actually draw benefits from the regulations. And we received 126 responses of firms of various different sizes, ranging from single owner small firms to some large firms with revenues over R1 billion. Now, what the survey, so even though it is difficult to get a representative survey, this is just the best that we have. And so the important thing about the results are that they are representative of what firms themselves actually report. And so they are going to be illuminating about firm experiences for a wide variety of firms across different industries. Now, what we find first off is a high level of non-compliance, and we'll talk about why firms choose not to comply with the regulations. And I think another thing that's particularly striking about the survey is that when you ask firms about not just the cost, but also whether they benefit from the regulations, we find that a very striking result that very few firms report that they benefit from complying or would benefit from improving their BEE scores. I think as the point that Donald has made already, I think is very pertinent, that in the case of share ownership of listed companies, it is also clear that there has not only been a decline in the deals that are being done over time, but also that there is a significant discount that applies to shares that are in such schemes. And so even the intended beneficiaries of some of these schemes are not benefiting to the extent that they might expect. So let's dig into the responses from the survey. The first thing that you'll notice is that about over a third of firms are either non-compliant or at level 8. And so a large proportion are choosing or are either choosing to not comply or the regulations do not apply to them. A large number of reasons are provided by survey participants. Apart from that the regulations don't apply, many firms say that they are either too small or they find the regulations to be discriminatory, or firms reported that the regulations are too expensive to comply to or would not provide them with any explicit benefits. It's, I think, important just to note that there's, as you can see from the distribution, that there are firms across the different BEE score levels in the survey. And as I'll show shortly, the firms that are in the survey are also, they range in revenue and in size terms, and are representative of a number of different industries. Again, the report has a lot more detail, so I'm just going to show you some very high-level results. What this slide does is look at what the setup costs are for firms of that have different BEE accreditation levels. The costs to set up BEE strategies or structures vary dramatically across different kinds of firms. And they depend not only on the size of the firm, but also on the industry that a firm might be in, and then the choices that they make, because there are different ways that one could comply. Some firms face no setup costs. For example, if a firm is very small and is completely black owned, or the founders of the firm are black, then there may be maybe zero setup costs. But for other firms, setup or advisory or accreditation fees can be very large. What we do on the slide is we show the rand values, where we've expressed these in 2025 rand values to make sure that we account for inflation appropriately. But these amounts are very large. So they range between about 200,000 rand to well over 500,000 rand. And these can be very large for small firms. Across the different compliance groupings, they range between 0.4% and 4% of turnover. So this is very expensive for firms, and that we see that they are more expensive for firms that are near thresholds, so thresholds of, say, the 10 million rand per year turnover level, and for firms that are under 50 employees. Next, what we do is we look at what the annual costs are for firms to comply. There's a whole range of different ways that firms can achieve BEE scores. These include things like skills development programs, supplier development, vendor financing, socioeconomic development programs, but also the internal costs that they bear to comply. So these could be explicit accreditation costs, internal administrative or staffing costs or time, systems and software, as well as verification fees, accreditation costs, and legal advisory costs that firms bear with respect to these programs. Again, we express the amounts that firms reported based on their annual financial documentation range significantly. They range between 150,000 rand and well over 2 million rand a year. And to account for firms of being of different sizes, when we express this to turnover, the medians for each of the accreditation levels range between 1% and 5% of turnover. But if we express this as a proportion of net profit, it can be even larger. The medians range between 6% and 32% of net profit. And there are even some outlier firms that report that these ongoing costs are a multiple of their annual net profit. So they can be, it's not just the setup costs that are large, the ongoing costs to maintain specific compliance levels can be very high as well. Now, it's really important when thinking about regulations to think not just about their costs, but also about potential benefits. And so the survey explicitly looked at whether compliance might provide growth opportunities for firms that comply, and so support growth in jobs or in new investment. And so we asked firms whether raising their BEE scores would provide them with any commercial benefits. And you can see that the majority of firms reported that they don't see any benefit in complying beyond their current level of compliance. And if we asked firms whether on net the regulations contributed to new employment, again, very few firms reported that they have grown their staffing complement because of these regulations. Only 4% of firms in the survey reported higher employment directly attributable to these regulations. Now, an important question is whether firms actually made investments as a consequence of BEE regulations. And so we asked firms whether they either reinvested in order to grow their business or undertook new investments. And as you can see from the chart, a large proportion of firms say that that the consequence of the regulations have been for them to reduce either the reinvestment that they undertake, as well as any new investments or new ventures that they undertake. Now, there's a lot more detail. All of the survey questions are summarized in the report. But overall, what the results show is that the BEE regulations act as a stealth tax, that these taxes that they imply are so large that for many firms, they strongly disincentivize either growth or even the undertaking of new ventures, and that they don't just bear on white firms, but they bear on many firms, a large proportion of firms. And so as a result, there is an ongoing compliance costs that contribute to South Africa's high regulatory burden. The report has a long section that looks at the macroeconomic environment over the last 2 decades in South Africa. And the argument that we make is that like multilateral institutions like the OECD have argued for South Africa, that a high and rising regulatory burden in South Africa has contributed to making South Africa an expensive place to do business, and has contributed to South Africa's slow economic growth, particularly when you express it on a per capita basis. So I think a useful way to represent this idea is the economic framework known as the Laffer curve. And the Laffer curve is based on the idea that more tax does not necessarily mean more tax revenue, that beyond a certain point, if tax rates are increased, that firms or individuals will undertake actions to reduce their tax burden. So they'll either make less effort to comply, there'll be less incentive for businesses to be part of the formal sector or undertake investment, or there'll be active attempts at avoidance or non-compliance. And so what we argue in the report is that South Africa's framework has gotten to a point where it is getting very expensive for firms to comply. We observe this in a rise in non-compliance. We see this in a decline in the number of BEE deals that are being undertaken over time, which suggests that there is less value being created from such activities. And if we think of the direction of travel at the moment in these policies, that the amendments to the frameworks that are currently moving through the legislative process are based on the assumption that by increasing the effective tax that these regulations imply or forcing compliance, this will see increased investment and job creation. Now, we argue that this is the opposite of what we've actually observed over the last 2 decades. And so continuing to strengthen these regulations by raising the effective tax rate that they imply will achieve the opposite of what the promoters of these regulations are trying to achieve.
Thank you, Daan. I'm going to wrap up my part of this, and then we'll hop through to the questions, which I see have been coming through. So I guess in summary, we come up with three things. The first is the BEE Commission really needs to put effort into releasing their data, both for whether it be academics to study or just people in the market to better understand what is going on. By far, the richest repository of this data is sitting at the Commission. We're not asking the Commission to put resources into doing the analysis, just make the data available so that we can have a conversation that is less connected to how people feel about it. The conversation becomes less emotive, and we can focus our efforts on understanding what the realities are. This is our best attempt to deal with that. But should the Commission be open to making this data available, we would certainly be very interested in updating these findings. And if we're wrong, then we'll state that too. The second issue is we have to benchmark against outcomes. The outcome can't be that we must have BEE forever. We have to be able to say there is a trade-off, as there is with every single policy. We cannot treat the policy as if it is simply just all good. There is a cost. We need to understand what that cost is. We've got to look at what the effects of all of our policies are, not just our BEE policies. What are the effects of our policies on growth, on investment, on employment? If we don't get growth into the economy, then none of the other things are really going to follow. And importantly, we have to separate the tool from the goal. The goal is to see a transformed South Africa. I have a friend who calls it a normalized South Africa. I think that's a proper, noble objective. But if BEE is not getting us there, and all we can do is say that the problem is we have to hit people with a larger stick, then achieving that goal of transformation is unlikely to happen. In order for us to have an honest conversation as a country around achieving that incredibly important goal, we can't be in a position where the tool that is being chosen for this is not open to scrutiny. And I believe that is it, guys. We're very happy to take your questions. If you just give me one moment here to grab my sanity, I'm going to quickly bring up the questions. Okay, Christina asks, Daan and Donald, this is really cool. Can you do this graph on the left, previous slide, by compliance level? Okay, Christina, what we'll do is we'll take those sorts of questions offline, and we'll pop out an update. So a good way to do that, by the way, is please subscribe to both the content that Codera puts out and that XA puts out. They're very different to each other, but both of us will be posting updates on this over the next few weeks. So please subscribe to either blog and follow us on LinkedIn, and you'll get the updates as they happen.
It's also worth noting that we go through every question in the survey in the report. So there is a lot more detail than what we showed. So we do have outcomes by compliance level for each of the questions. But what I'll do is reflect on any of these questions, and I'll make different versions as needed.
Manuel asks, did you get the inflection point?
So we used that. That plot was really just an illustrative way to make the point in the report. I think maybe just to go into a bit more detail, what's very clear from the survey responses is that for many firms, the compliance costs are either so large that it doesn't make sense for them to comply, or even for some larger firms that have chosen to be level 2 or level 1, the compliance costs nonetheless are very large as a proportion of turnover or net profit. And so what this means is if you think of the tax burden that firms in South Africa face relative to other countries, South Africa, just on the taxes that companies and individuals bear, we're already towards the high end of what the tax burdens that amongst OECD economies. And so if you think of these sorts of regulations that also bear on firms, it means that the effective tax rates in South Africa are actually quite high and higher than people generally appreciate. Now, I think it's really important to say this again. This study is not an authoritative guide on the cost and benefits of these regulations. We make the point in the report that there are many policies aimed at redress in South Africa. We don't look at employment equity or some of the other policy frameworks that also bear on the same issue. And it is really important that these all get policy and academic attention. Now, what we're trying to do with this report is raise awareness that there is just no cost-benefit analysis being undertaken on policies that actually have a very large impact on firm decisions and affect South Africa's cost competitiveness and the likelihood that firms employ or invest. And so these are going to have macroeconomic implications. And again, this is just not something that has received policy attention. And it is just incredible that given the amount of effort that is undertaken for firms to report on these regulations, that there is just no work being done on understanding whether the regulations are achieving the goals of the regulations at an acceptable cost. And this is, Donald and I have written about the same topic in other areas, and I think this is something that is true of many South African regulations, that there is a need for policy evaluation and cost-benefit analysis across the board.
Yeah, I think just an important addition to that, there's interesting documents that have been published, for example, even by the presidency a couple of years ago, looking at how policies should be formulated and assessed. There's clearly very good thinking inside of government how to do that, but the reality is those assessments typically never happen or seldom happen. And so what ends up, or they happen in a way that is slanted to give the answer that you want. So we see, for example, that if we look at the tightening of the employment equity rules, which is a slightly different issue to this, but complementary, if you like, there's a baked-in assumption that the reason companies are not meeting their legally mandated requirements is because they don't want to. And what you've got to do, again, is just apply enough pressure and they will. And then that assumes that if you've got that right, good things will flow from that. Except that doesn't in any way flow. So we also have to look at better ways to think about policy and sometimes also accept that there are some things where changing the rules and the laws doesn't always get you to the objective. So yes, just a quick housekeeping note, because I've seen a few questions pop up about it. This slide deck, the recording, and the report will be circulated this afternoon to everyone who registered. Kulikani, very good to have you here. Kulikani asks, has the survey considered what the utility of the Transformation Fund could have, if any, in resolving these compliance challenges? Secondly, as talks start up again about Elon Musk bringing Starlink to SA, what role do EEIPs play in enhancing transformation? So, Kulikani, let me maybe deal with the Transformation Fund. Firstly, you write about it, as many do in the singular. There are somewhere around 40 transformation funds already floating around in the economy. Now, not all of them are called transformation funds, but we have many versions of the Transformation Fund already. And this comes back to a policy question, which is, before we create a new transformation fund, should we not understand why the other funds have been ineffective? So we're going to extract potentially 100 billion rand out of the economy. So call that a tax, which is what we would. We'd say we're going to raise another 100 billion in tax revenue. But we've raised all of this other money. We don't know why the problem wasn't solved before. So I would argue it's difficult to answer the question of whether the transformation fund would work, because that assumes that the problem is there's insufficient capital and that the transformation fund can therefore bridge that gap. It is not obvious to me that that is the case. So Nadia, could I ask, when you circulate this, please also circulate the very short report Wangani did in looking at the various transformation funds. We'll circulate that to all of you, and you can take a look at it again. The question of Elon Musk, Daan can maybe see if he wants to add to my comment here, but I think there are two different things here, which is, forget about Elon and his sometimes rather noxious personality, and just simply say there's an outside company that wants to invest in South Africa. South Africa is capital starved as a country. We are definitely not investing at the rates we have to. By the way, that's not a contentious observation. The president himself talks about it all the time. So everyone knows we need investment. The question is, how expensive do we want to make it when a foreign company says, I want to put my money in South Africa? And so if we're saying to them, well, we want your money and we're going to give you these 5 conditions, then there's going to be a smaller pool of people willing to put their money in. South Africa has a very long list of conditions you need to comply with. And it's not just BEE. There are many, many other rules. If you want to invest in a mining company, we're going to tell you, you must make an investment here, but we don't have a functional cadastral system that allows you to easily track who owns which reserves, etc. And so we keep adding these costs to investment, but at the same time wondering why people don't invest. And I think when we look at foreign investment particularly, these are companies that are bringing their own money. Well, they're not companies arriving here asking us for our capital. If we're going to say to them, if you want to put an investment here and we're going to give you these conditions, we should not be shocked when some portion of them say, we'd rather not do it. And that's the reality. So, I'm no fan of how Elon Musk has dealt with all of this, but the deeper question is investment required, and why are we making investment so expensive? Sorry, Daan.
I think it's worth just adding that this isn't just Donald's opinion. In the report, we have a chart where we summarize assessments of South Africa's policy framework relative to others. And by the OECD's assessment, South Africa scores very high by international standards on not being open to, let's say, foreign direct investment. And
that's not good, by the way.
Yes, so sorry. We have a very low score of openness to FDI, and we have very high regulatory burdens, very high levels of red tape, and very burdensome licensing requirements, as well as the things that raise the cost of doing business in South Africa compared to other countries. So it is something that we also see in our investment rate, and so we have a lot of emphasis in the report on what the implications of a low investment rate has been. And just one thing that I'll just add is that we see this bearing out in the extent to which we see innovation in South Africa. We have very low rates of research and development compared to countries with similar rates of economic development. And if we want to make the economy more grow faster and employ more people, we really need foreign investment, and we need both local investment and we need foreign investment. And so I think this is a key issue to address.
Anonymous asks, why would firms seek compliance level 1 if the cost outweighs the benefit? And two, what would you replace BEE with? Don, do you want to maybe take a swing at the first part of that?
I think the question answers itself.
They wouldn't.
So again, I think we have a line in the report which says that at these rates of effective taxes, it's either economically irrational or completely prevents firm startup. So you can see from firm behavior that some firms choose to comply at level 1 or level 2, and those tend to be firms where they see market access benefits from complying. And even for those firms, the implicit costs of doing so are very high when expressed relative to turnover. So some firms will bear the costs so long as the benefits are larger than the costs. You can see from the extent of non-compliance that many of the firms in our survey choose not to comply. It might not be necessarily that the costs are higher than the benefits for them. These regulations may just not bind on some of those businesses. But that's why we argue that we need a fuller cost-benefit analysis, because the costs, I think, are much higher than most people appreciate. And then on the second question, maybe I could throw it back.
Sure. So the simple answer is, firstly, it's not obvious to me you have to replace it. So you don't have to have an active government intervention on every single problem. So sometimes you need to let the economy sort itself out to some degree. So stop, for example, if we just use the Sasol share, imagine for a moment that the beneficiaries of that scheme were simply given the Sasol share, not the BEE share. They were just given that share. There would be a portion of those that got rid of that share and they just sold it and they banked the money for it, just like shareholders do every single day on the JSE. And there'll be a portion that say, well, we think Sasol can do great things, we're going to hang on to it. The problem when you have this sort of interference is you remove the ability of a person to use their own wealth in a way that they feel is best for themselves. And you take that and you turn what should simply be an investment. But when Sasol does poorly and someone says, you know what, I want out of the share, I want to get out and I want to go put my money into a completely different company, well, now you're restricted. So it's not just that you're restricted and your alternative would have been to go and buy a different Sasol share. You might want to be in a completely different part, or you want to sell your shares and just buy a house, whatever the case might be. Those constraints are now placed on you, so you can't do it. I think if we're going to have a conversation about what should replace BEE, with my own caveats in place, I think we need to first accept that BEE has not worked. So in order to say what should replace it, the conversation can't be that BEE can never be replaced. And there are people considerably better skilled than Daan or I who study this at universities who give probably much better input than we could on that. But in order to do that, you can't be burnt at the stake for expressing a view on BEE. There has to be a way to have this conversation where we could say, this hasn't worked. That is a problem. We need to get to this goal. How do we get there? And I think I would argue that's the best. I'm certainly not the best person, and I doubt Daan is, to recommend the replacement.
I would say that we need a coherent framework for thinking about achieving inclusive growth.
Yes.
So at the moment, the direction of travel is for a proliferation of regulations that have, for which some element of the policy objective is something like a transformation. But what's happening is that it's just adding to the regulatory burden in South Africa, and there's just no assessment of whether these policies are achieving the objectives that have been set out. We have a chart in the report where we look at the number of acts that have been promulgated in South Africa over time. and there's just been a ratcheting up of the amount of rules that bear on companies. So we really need a stock take, and we really need an honest conversation about how best do we achieve our goals, given that our GDP per capita has been declining for the last decade or more.
Papitso, very good to have you here. Papitso asks, this may be out of context, but out of interest, do you think the board chairs and or CEO's race had an impact on BEE compliance? That's to be clear, we didn't look at that. So I think, Papitso, that's a very good question to ask, but we simply have no idea what the race is of the people who responded, actually. But I do like the question. I'm going to apply my mind to that, actually. I think there's something there worth thinking about. Philip says, what is a transformed economy? Equal income percentages between groups, even if most are unemployed. You want to take a swing at that, Don?
Maybe a different way of thinking about that question is, what are the goals of these policies? And I think it's not very clear what is meant, what the intended outcomes are. So B-BBEE is focused on some elements of it are focused on ownership, and some elements are focused on procurement or the development of the workforce. Employment equity rules are about the transformation of the labor force, and ultimately not just the labor force overall, but senior management across the economy. So one can measure some of these things. The relationship between the rules and these outcomes are probably not well thought through all the time. And what we show in the report is that even if you take, if you think of transformation of the workforce, there actually has not been as much, there has not, by very simple metrics of transformation, like the race and gender composition of South Africa's workforce at different levels, whether that's professionally employed, senior management, or top management of firms, there's been less transformation by that definition than one might have expected. So by those measures, these policies have not, there has not been, they've not succeeded at really transforming either the labor market or the ownership structure of South Africa in a durable way. And of course, the main focus of our work here is really, it's about whether we could, in a counterfactual, over the last 15 years, have had faster growth, more investment, more employment growth if we'd had different micro and macro policies. And our conjecture is that what these regulations are doing is actually making South Africans worse off overall. So I think Philip's question is a good one, which is because it's about what do we mean by these terms? How do we measure them? And certainly the problem with many of these regulations is that, as Donald has said, there isn't any attempt at demonstrating or even assessing whether they're working.
Yeah. I'd maybe add something to this, which is, we didn't touch on this here, but to have an economy that thrives, it's not just a question of policy. So, we live in a country where 50% of all kids will never finish high school. And so that gives us an enormous portion of our population which are functionally illiterate and innumerate. And that creates all kinds of problems around employment. So we've got to address the more foundational issues at some point as well, which is to say, in a country whose basic education system is failing, addressing many of these other problems becomes really, really hard. If you want an innovative environment, then you've got to allow people to innovate. You've got to allow them to fail when they fail. They've got to kind of feel how the market treats their ideas. What we tend to do in South Africa is, because of the dire state of our economy, everything is viewed through the lens of we can't allow something to fail. So businesses which very often have no right to continue existing any longer become a drain on state resources, not just money, but other factors that go into supporting them. And so what happens in that environment is the message doesn't entirely get through that a failure is okay and you move on. Instead, what we do is we prop them up, and then that tends to have this effect of slowing down how the whole economy itself operates. So if we're going to have a thriving economy, we've got to do the hard work on infrastructure, security, ports, roads, rail, all of those things, education, etc. I mean, certainly this is not a fix to the whole economy, but we just think it's an important factor which seems to override all other conversation at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I see Manuel says self-selection and over-reporting might be a problem in this setting. Absolutely, we go to great pains in the report to say that our survey is certainly not representative, even though we tried our best to get as broad a reach as possible. It's very difficult to address that without actually having access to bigger data. I think the other challenge is that firms are very reluctant to answer sensitive questions like the ones posed, but also just burdensome questions. It's very difficult for a firm to go and look at its financials and pull and do all the calculations we asked of them. So the survey itself is burdensome. These are difficult, hot button topics. You will always struggle to get representativeness in any survey. So we're certainly not claiming that this is how all firms feel, but this is what we've represented in the report is how some cross-section of South African firms feel. And our real plea is for data. We are certainly not claiming that this is the final word on this very important topic.
Yeah, TJ, your question, I'm so glad you could make it, by the way. What elements would you suggest be changed to ensure that economic growth is accompanied by transformation? So I'd say, firstly, there's an important sequence that has to be respected here. The first is you've got to have growth first. Transformation without growth is simply taking things from one person and giving them to another. And in that process, there's friction, and so you tend to be somewhat worse off at the end of it. So there has to be growth, and South Africa has a growth problem. And our growth problem is not because of BEE by any stretch, but we have a growth problem, and we've got to address that. All of the good things that we want to do are dependent on growth. It's maybe worth remembering what happens after the 94 elections. Where did the money come from for the social programs that ended up being funded? And those social programs came out of growth. So in a country that's growing, you can do all sorts of things. In a country that's not growing, your options are unbelievably limited. And we are not growing. In fact, not only are we not growing, at a per capita level, we are shrinking. And that's a dire situation. So we can debate the merits of BEE and transformation till the cows come home. If we don't address the growth problem, we will never have the capital to deal with the other issues. TJ, I don't have any other countries offhand, but again, I'm going to think about that. And I'd like to I'll give you a call offline and we can discuss it. Simon says, considering that economic inequality is a reality, what are the recommendations on alternatives? Simon, yeah, I mean, that's just, I don't have an answer to that, to be honest with you. But because you don't know what the alternative is to banging your head against the wall doesn't mean you should keep banging your head against the wall. There are other ways to not have a headache. And I think this is, and that's maybe a little flippant, but I think what's important to note is this is not working. And the idea that what we do is we just keep doing the thing that is not working is insane. I'm sure there are other alternatives. And I'm sure if we created an environment where those conversations could happen a lot could be accomplished. Sadly, I don't have an answer to you for how or what those alternatives would look like. But we do know that this clearly is not working. And then Leonard says, if indeed there are many versions of the transformation fund out there, as you assert, what is lacking to attain the goals of transformation in SA? Well, Leonard, that's an extremely good question. And I think to some degree, our policies are part of the reason why we don't get to transformation. Transformation is about opportunities for people. If we create a level playing field where a child who's born in Diepsloot and a child who's born in Bryanston have exactly the same opportunities, you would begin to see considerably more transformation. The challenge we have in South Africa is the child born in Diepsloot almost certainly is going to end up in a much worse position. So those foundational issues, to my mind, the education, the safety, the fact that the child in Bryanston has 3 square healthy meals a day, and the child in Diepsloot is eating poor food every second day. These are factors that have nothing to do with BEE. And what we're attempting to do, from my perspective, is we're trying to ignore many of those politically difficult questions and impose a solution on the top. In other words, we're trying to force people to transform, even if the economics from their own perspective don't actually encourage them to do the transformation. This is a very long answer. Don, do you want to take a swing at that?
Maybe to just go back to what Donald said earlier, part of for me, it's partly a framework question. So we have many redistributive policies in South Africa. We could do a lot better at achieving, if we had a more effective state, if we spent a rand of tax better and we had better outcomes, that would go a long way. The transformation funds are an add-on that that may do some good if they are channeled the right way. The problem is, to me, that unlike, say, that the tax system, transformation funds are not transparent. We don't really know how that money is spent, what the governance arrangements are around them. I think it creates a number of different other challenges. And so the question is just, do we have the right policy framework to achieve these goals, to deal with South Africa's substantial challenges? And importantly, are we doing it on a cost-effective basis? So the cost to collect, we have a series of blog posts where we look at SARS's effectiveness at collecting revenue, and it costs about 0.7 of a cent to collect a rand of tax revenue when SARS does it. What we're arguing in this note, in this report, is that to achieve a unit of outcome from in terms of B-BBEE costs a lot more. And so the question is just, are there ways for us to reduce the costs of the things, the regulations, and maximize the benefits that we achieve? And there must be alternatives. And unfortunately, the reason we wrote this report is because this has become such a hot button topic that the debates are purely ideological, as opposed to going back to the data and asking, what does the data tell us about what works, what isn't working, and helps us understand what aspects of policies that we need to fix.
Yeah. All right, guys, you'll receive the full information pack in the course of late afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time out. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.